On a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, the sun rose slow and soft over Atlanta, casting long shadows across quiet sidewalks and freshly swept storefronts. The air carried that familiar mix of coffee, exhaust, and the faint sweetness of blooming magnolias. Inside a modest brick building on Peachtree Street, the First Metro Bank opened its doors right at 9 a.m., as it had done every weekday for decades. Fluorescent lights hummed to life, tellers arranged their pens and notepads, and the assistant manager, new to the branch but full of rigid ideas about efficiency, adjusted his tie in the back office mirror. At 9:17, an elderly woman stepped through the glass doors. She moved slowly, deliberately, one hand gripping a wooden cane with a rubber tip, the other clutching a small faded purse. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back and she wore a light cardigan despite the warm morning, old habits from winters long past. She'd walked the 6 blocks from her apartment, as she did every month to deposit her Social Security check. She didn't trust online banking. Too many ghosts in those machines, she'd once told her neighbor with a chuckle. Besides, she liked seeing familiar faces, even if fewer of them remained each year. She'd been coming to this branch since the 1980s. Back then, the manager knew her by name, remembered her late husband's laugh, and always offered her a hard candy from the dish on his desk. Now most of the staff were strangers, younger, faster, always looking at screens, never quite meeting her eyes, but she didn't mind much. She figured the world moved on. She just hoped it wouldn't forget how to be kind. She took a number, 42, and sat in one of the stiff-backed chairs near the window. The waiting area was quiet except for the low murmur of a news channel playing on a wall-mounted TV and the occasional beep of a keypad. She unfolded her check carefully, smoothing the creases with her thumb. Her eyesight had gotten worse over the winter. Reading small print now felt like trying to catch smoke with her fingers. She pulled a pair of reading glasses from her purse, but even with them, the numbers blurred at the edges. When her number flashed on the screen, she stood slowly, wincing just slightly at the ache in her knees, and made her way to counter 3. Behind it stood a man in his early 30s, crisp shirt, name tag pinned just so. He glanced up as she approached, but his expression didn't change. No smile, no nod, just a flat stare that said, "Hurry up." "Good morning," she said softly, placing her check and deposit slip on the counter. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he tapped rapidly on his keyboard, eyes fixed on the monitor. After a few seconds, he sighed, just loud enough to be heard, and finally looked at her. "You know you can deposit checks at the ATM, right?" "It's faster," she blinked. I know, but I like to do it in person. Makes me feel sure it's done right." He exhaled through his nose, shook his head almost imperceptibly, and reached for the papers. But as he scanned the deposit slip, his brow furrowed. "This isn't filled out correctly," he said, pushing it back. "You missed the account number section." She leaned forward, squinting. "I thought I wrote it." "It's smudged, illegible." His tone was clipped, final. "Just use the ATM next time. Or better yet, sign up for mobile deposit." She hesitated. "Could you maybe help me rewrite it? My hands shake a little these days." For a moment, he just stared at her as if weighing whether this small act of patience was worth his time. Then, without warning, his voice rose, just enough to turn heads in the small lobby. "Ma'am, you're holding up the line. People are waiting." She glanced behind her. There were only 2 others in the bank, one on the phone near the door, another filling out a form at a desk. But the shame hit her anyway, hot and sudden like a splash of scalding water. She fumbled with her pen, trying to steady her hand, but the ink bled through the paper. That's when he stood up. Not to help, not to offer a new slip. He stepped out from behind the counter, his posture stiff, jaw set. "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside," he said, voice low but firm. "You're disrupting service," her breath caught. "I'm not, I just need a minute." Before she could finish, he gently but firmly gripped her upper arm just above the elbow. Not hard enough to bruise, but with a pressure that left no room for argument. She gasped, more from shock than pain, and her cane slipped from her other hand. "Clattering against the tile floor, please," she whispered. But he was already guiding her toward the exit, his grip unyielding. A few customers watched, wide-eyed, but no one spoke. No one moved. The automatic doors hissed open, and just like that, she was outside, blinking in the sunlight, her heart pounding in her chest. He didn't say another word. Just bent down, picked up her cane, and placed it on the sidewalk beside her before stepping back inside. The doors closed with a soft click. She stood there for a long moment, stunned. Cars passed. A delivery truck rumbled by. A teenager on a scooter glanced at her but kept going. She felt invisible, not just overlooked but erased. Like her presence had been a mistake, an inconvenience to be removed. Slowly, she bent to retrieve her cane, her joints protesting the motion. Her deposit slip and check were still clutched in her hand, now crumpled at the edges. She looked back at the bank through the glass. The man was already back at his station, typing away as if nothing had happened. She didn't cry. Not yet. Tears would come later in the quiet of her apartment, when she replayed the moment over and over, wondering if she'd said the wrong thing, moved too slow, taken up too much space in a world that no longer seemed to have room for people like her. But right then, on that sidewalk, all she felt was a deep, hollow ache, the kind that doesn't come from being yelled at or pushed, but from being treated like you don't matter. She turned and began the long walk home, each step heavier than the last. The check remained undeposited. Her rent was due Friday, and for the first time in years, she wondered if maybe she should just stay inside from now on. The morning sun kept shining, warm and indifferent, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The sidewalk felt longer on the way back. Every step sent a dull throb through her knees, but it was the weight in her chest that slowed her down the most. She kept her eyes on the pavement, not out of shame exactly, though that was there too, but because looking up meant seeing the world go on as if nothing had happened. Cars honked. People laughed into their phones. A dog barked from a porch. Life, loud and careless, moved forward without her. She passed the little coffee shop on the corner, the one with the chalkboard sign that always had a new quote. Today it read, "Kindness costs nothing." She almost smiled, but the word stung instead. She quickened her pace, cane tapping softly against the concrete. Back in her apartment, a one-bedroom on the third floor with thin walls and a view of the laundromat across the street, she didn't turn on the lights. She just sat at her kitchen table, still in her cardigan, and laid the crumpled check and deposit slip beside her teacup. The cup was empty, but she wrapped her hands around it anyway, as if warmth might return on its own. She didn't call anyone. Who would she call? Her sister had passed 2 winters ago. Her neighbors were friendly enough, but she didn't want pity. And she certainly didn't want to be the poor old lady who got thrown out of the bank. That sounded like something from a news clip, not her life. She'd worked hard all her years, first as a seamstress, then as a school cafeteria aide, always showing up, always doing her part. She didn't ask for much, just to be treated like a person. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, painting stripes across the linoleum floor. She stared at them, unmoving, until her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. But the thought of cooking felt like climbing a mountain, so she stayed put, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren. Meanwhile, across the street, a young woman named Tasha, barely 25, with bright earrings and a nose ring, was closing up the cafe for her afternoon break. She'd seen the whole thing from the window while wiping down the espresso machine. At first, she thought maybe the woman had been arguing or causing a scene. But then she saw the way the bank employee had gripped her arm, the way the older woman's shoulders had slumped as she stepped outside. There was no anger in her, just quiet shock. Tasha had wanted to run over right then, but she was mid-shift, and her manager was already eyeing her for taking too many emotional breaks, so she waited. And when her break finally came, she filled a to-go cup with chamomile tea, no sugar, just a splash of honey, and crossed the street. She knocked softly on the apartment door. No answer at first, then a shuffling sound and the chain unlatched. The older woman opened the door just a crack, eyes wary. "Yes? I saw what happened at the bank," Tasha said gently, holding out the cup. "Thought you might like some tea." For a long moment there was silence. Then the door opened a little wider. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Tasha said, "but I wanted to." She wasn't invited in and she didn't push. They stood in the hallway for a few minutes, the older woman sipping the tea, Tasha leaning against the railing. They didn't talk much, just small things. The weather, the new bus schedule, how the laundromat's dryer had been broken for weeks. But in that quiet exchange, something shifted. The older woman's shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. And when Tasha finally said she had to get back to work, The woman thanked her, not just for the tea, but for seeing her. Back at the cafe, Tasha mentioned what she'd seen to a regular customer, an older man who came in every day for black coffee and the crossword. He frowned. That's the third time this month someone's complained about that branch. My cousin tried to cash a bond there last week and they treated him like he was trying to rob the place. Word spread quietly after that, not in headlines, but in hushed conversations at bus stops, in grocery lines, in church pews. Someone else had been there that morning, standing near the door waiting to wire money to their grandson overseas. They'd pulled out their phone and recorded the last few seconds. The arm grab, the cane falling, the door closing. They didn't post it right away. They weren't looking for views. But later that afternoon, after hearing Tasha's story at the cafe, they sent the clip to a local community group on social media with a simple caption. This happened today, at First Metro on Peachtree. The woman didn't do anything wrong. Within an hour, the video had been shared dozens of times, not because it was dramatic. There was no shouting, no violence, but because it felt so ordinary. That was what made it hurt. It wasn't a rare outrage. It was the kind of thing that could happen to anyone's grandmother, aunt, or neighbor, and no one would blink. At home, the older woman knew nothing of the video. She'd taken off her shoes, washed her face, and sat by the window with a slice of toast. She still hadn't deposited her check. Rent was due Friday and her savings were thin. She thought about going back to the bank tomorrow, maybe early before it got busy, but the idea made her stomach twist. What if he was there again? What if no one helped her? She looked at the phone on the wall, the old corded one she kept because it never lost signal. She picked it up, then set it down. Who could she call? And what would she even say? I got thrown out for asking for help. It sounded silly out loud, embarrassing, but deep down she knew it wasn't silly. It wasn't right. And yet she felt small, like her voice wouldn't matter against a whole system that moved too fast for people like her. As evening fell, the streetlights flickered on. The laundromat across the way buzzed with activity. Mothers folding clothes, teenagers waiting for their jeans to dry. Life again going on. She turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the city breathe. She didn't know it yet, but someone was already on his way to town, someone who remembered her from years ago, who'd seen her serve meals to folks with nowhere else to go, who knew her laugh and the way she always tucked an extra cookie into kids' lunch bags. He didn't know what had happened today, but he was about to find out, and when he did, he wouldn't just feel bad. He'd do something, but for now, in the quiet of her apartment, she was alone with her thoughts, her tea gone cold, her check still unsigned, and the heavy question hanging in the air. Does anyone still see me? The answer she feared was no, but she was wrong. The afternoon sun was starting to dip behind the taller buildings when a black SUV rolled to a stop near the bank on Peachtree Street. It wasn't flashy, just clean, quiet, and well kept. The man who stepped out moved with a calm kind of ease, like someone used to being noticed but never needing to prove anything. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, jeans, and sunglasses, and if you didn't look twice, you might not even realize who he was. But folks around Atlanta knew. He'd been part of the community for years, not just as a famous face, but as someone who showed up, listened, and stayed long after the cameras left. He'd just wrapped up a youth basketball clinic at a nearby rec center. Nothing fancy, just sneakers squeaking on hardwood, kids laughing, and the kind of coaching that focused more on respect than rebounds. He liked those days best. No press, no scripts, just real people doing real things. On his way back to his hotel, he remembered he needed to stop by the bank to sign some paperwork for a small business loan he was backing, a local bookstore trying to stay open. He preferred handling things in person. Paper doesn't lie, he'd say, and neither do people's eyes if you pay attention. As he stepped out of the car, he spotted an older woman sitting alone on the bench across from the bank. Something about her posture, the way her shoulders curved inward, the way she stared at her hands like they held answers, made him pause. He squinted, then took off his sunglasses. A memory clicked into place. Years ago, at a community dinner for seniors, he'd seen her serving plates with a warm smile, always making sure the quiet ones got seconds. She'd even slipped him a slice of peach cobbler when he said he missed his grandma's cooking. He never forgot that. He crossed the street slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he got close, he crouched down just enough so he wasn't towering over her. "Miss Evelyn?" he asked gently. She looked up, eyes tired but sharp. It took her a second, then her face softened. Oh my. Is that you?" He smiled. "Yeah, been a while." She tried to sit up straighter, smoothing her cardigan. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Just running errands," he said. Then after a beat, "You okay?" "You look like you've had a rough one." She hesitated. She didn't want to complain, didn't want to seem weak. But something in his voice, the quiet concern, the lack of hurry, made her feel safe. So she told him. Not with anger, not with drama, just simple words. How she'd gone to deposit her check. How the young man behind the counter had grown impatient. How he'd grabbed her arm and walked her out like she was a problem to be removed. She left out the worst parts. The shame, the fear of going back, but he heard them anyway in the spaces between her sentences. He didn't interrupt. Didn't offer empty platitudes like, "That's awful," or people these days. He just listened. And when she finished, he nodded slowly like he was weighing every word. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said finally. "Not one thing." She looked down at her hands again. I didn't want to cause trouble." "You didn't cause trouble," he said firmly. "They did." He stood, then offered his arm. "Come on, let's go fix this." She shook her head. "I don't want to make a scene." "You won't," he said. "We're not there for a scene. We're there for respect." She hesitated, then took his arm. He helped her up gently, making sure she had her cane steady before letting go. As they walked toward the bank, he stayed half a step behind her, not leading, just supporting. Like he wanted her to walk in on her own terms. Inside, the lobby was quieter now, the lunch rush long gone. The same assistant manager was at counter 3 typing away, earbuds in, oblivious. He didn't notice them at first. When he finally looked up and saw the older woman back at his counter, with him standing beside her, his face went pale. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice tight. The older woman opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the man beside her said calmly, "I'd like you to apologize to her." The assistant manager blinked. "Apologize? For what?" "For treating her like she didn't belong here," the man said, still calm, still quiet. "For grabbing her arm. For making her feel small in a place that's supposed to serve her." The young man stiffened. "Look, I was just following protocol." She was holding up the line, and the deposit slip wasn't filled out right. "We have procedures." "Procedures don't erase kindness," the man replied. "And they sure don't give you the right to manhandle someone." A few other staff members had stopped what they were doing. One teller glanced nervously toward the back office. The assistant manager crossed his arms. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is a private business. We handle things our way." The man didn't flinch. He just pulled out his phone, dialed a number he knew by heart, and waited. When the regional banking director answered, he said simply, "Hey, it's me. I'm at your Peachtree branch. We need to talk about how your staff treats elderly customers." He didn't raise his voice, didn't name drop aggressively, just stated the facts, what happened, who was involved, and why it mattered. Within minutes, the tone in the room shifted. The branch manager, a woman who'd been in the back during the earlier incident, rushed out, face flushed, apologizing profusely. The assistant manager was asked to step aside. A fresh deposit slip was brought out. A chair was offered, but more than that, the older woman was seen. Not as a burden, not as a delay, but as a person who deserved patience, dignity, and care. As she carefully rewrote her account number, her hand steadier now. Thanks to the calm in the room, the man stayed beside her. Not hovering, just present. When the transaction was complete and her receipt printed, he walked her back outside. "You sure you're okay to get home?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm fine. And thank you." "You didn't have to do that," he smiled. "Yeah, I did." He opened the passenger door of his SUV. "Let me drive you." She protested at first. "I can walk." But he insisted, not with force, just with quiet certainty. So she got in, clutching her purse like it held something precious. And as they drove through the late afternoon streets, they didn't talk much. Just the hum of the engine, the occasional turn signal, and the kind of silence that feels comfortable, not empty. He didn't post about it online. Didn't call the news. He just made sure she got home safe, helped her up the stairs, and waited until she unlocked her door before saying goodbye. As he walked back to his car, the sun was low in the sky, painting everything gold. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like someone who'd done what anyone should have done hours ago. And back in her apartment, the older woman stood by the window, watching his SUV disappear down the street. For the first time all day, she didn't feel invisible. She felt remembered. The next morning, the bank felt different. Not because anything had visibly changed. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The same plastic chairs lined the walls. But the air itself seemed heavier, like the room was holding its breath. The assistant manager didn't show up for his shift. No one said why, but the tellers exchanged quiet glances whenever someone asked for him. A new face stood behind counter 3. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Linda. She greeted every customer by name if she knew it, and with a warm good morning if she didn't. Inside the regional office downtown, things moved fast. The call from the night before hadn't been ignored. In fact, it had sent ripples through the chain of command. By 8 a.m., an internal review had been launched. Security footage was pulled. Statements were requested from staff and witnesses. The short video that had been circulating in neighborhood groups, it was now part of the official file. Not because it was viral. It never went beyond a few hundred views. But because it showed exactly what happened. No aggression from the customer. Only impatience and force from the employee. The bank's leadership knew they were on thin ice. Mistreating elderly customers wasn't just bad manners. It was a serious compliance risk. Federal guidelines, customer protection laws, even basic human decency, all pointed in one direction. This couldn't be brushed aside. And with someone of influence involved, someone who didn't need the spotlight but clearly cared deeply, the bank couldn't afford to look indifferent. By mid-morning, a formal apology letter was drafted. Not the generic kind that starts with "we regret any inconvenience," but one that named what happened. An employee acted in a manner inconsistent with our values of respect and service. It was hand-delivered to the older woman's apartment later that day by the branch manager herself, along with a small gift card for groceries and a promise. This won't happen again. Not to you, not to anyone. But the real change wasn't in the letter. It was in the actions that followed. That afternoon, the bank announced mandatory training for all frontline staff. Not just on policy, but on empathy, on aging, on how to assist customers with vision or mobility challenges without making them feel like a burden. They brought in a local senior advocacy group to lead the sessions. Role-playing exercises replaced dry PowerPoint slides. Employees practiced speaking slowly, offering a steadying hand, asking, "How can I help?" instead of assuming. Meanwhile, the older woman stayed home. She'd slept better than she had in weeks, though she still woke once in the night, half expecting to hear a knock or a phone call saying it was all a mistake. But morning came quietly. Her check had cleared. Her rent was safe. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she might actually belong in the world again. She didn't go back to the bank that day. She didn't need to. But she did sit on her porch in the late afternoon, sipping iced tea and watching the neighborhood come alive. Kids rode bikes. A couple walked their dog. The cafe across the street played soft jazz through an open window. Life, gentle and ordinary, unfolded around her. She thought about the man who'd helped her. She hadn't seen him since he dropped her off, and she didn't expect to. He had his own life, his own work. But what stayed with her wasn't his fame. It was the way he'd knelt beside her on that bench like her pain mattered. Like she mattered. A few days later, a package arrived at her door. No return address, just her name in neat handwriting. Inside was a hardcover book, The Warmth of Other Suns, and a note that read, "For the woman who never stopped caring. Keep sharing your light." She ran her fingers over the words and smiled. She didn't need to know who sent it. She already knew. Back at the bank, the assistant manager was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. He wasn't fired on the spot. Due process mattered, but his access to customer-facing duties was revoked immediately. In private conversations with HR, he admitted he'd been stressed, overwhelmed by new performance metrics, frustrated by slow customers. But he also admitted he'd crossed a line. "I thought I was being efficient," he said quietly. "But I wasn't being human." That admission, small as it was, became part of the training materials. Not to shame him, but to teach others. Efficiency without compassion is just coldness dressed up as progress. The story never became national news. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no fiery press conferences. But in the neighborhood, it became a quiet turning point. People started paying more attention, not just to how they were treated, but to how they treated others. A grocery clerk began offering to read labels for older shoppers. A bus driver waited an extra few seconds for someone struggling with steps. Small acts, yes, but they added up. The cafe owner even started a kindness counter, a little jar on the register where customers could leave spare change to cover someone else's coffee. The first donation, a $20 bill with a note for Miss Evelyn's tea. And through it all, the older woman kept living her life. She went back to volunteering at the community center, though she took the bus now instead of walking. She deposited her next check without a single problem. Linda remembered her name before she even reached the counter. And when the man who'd helped her pass through town again a month later, he stopped by her porch with a bag of peaches from a local farm. They sat in the shade, talking about nothing important, the weather, a new mural going up downtown, how the grandkids were doing. No cameras, no audience, just two people sharing a moment of real connection. That's what made the difference in the end. Not punishment, not publicity, but presence. The choice to see someone, to stand beside them, and to say without words, "You're not alone." The bank fixed its policies. The staff learned new habits, but the real healing happened in the quiet spaces between people, on benches, porches, and counters, where kindness wasn't a policy, but a practice. And in those moments, dignity wasn't given. It was remembered. Months passed, and the sharp edges of that Tuesday morning at the bank softened into memory. The kind of memory that doesn't sting anymore but still teaches. The older woman didn't talk about it much, not because she was ashamed, but because she'd rather focus on what came after. The quiet kindnesses, the small repairs, the way a community can stitch itself back together when someone dares to say,
"This isn't right." She still went to the bank every month, but now it felt different.
not just because the staff greeted her by name or offered her a seat before she even asked, but because she walked in like she belonged. And she did. She always had. It just took someone else remembering that for her to believe it again. The new assistant manager, Linda, had turned out to be more than just polite. She remembered that the older woman liked deposit slips with extra space for writing, so she kept a stack ready. She noticed when the air conditioning was too cold and brought a light blanket from the back office on particularly chilly days. Nothing grand, just human things, the kind that say, "I see you," without needing a speech. One afternoon, as the older woman finished her transaction, Linda leaned in slightly and said, "We're starting a customer advisory group, just a few folks from the neighborhood to give us honest feedback. Would you consider joining?" She almost said no. She wasn't the type to sit on committees. But then she thought about it. Maybe her voice, soft as it was, could help make sure no one else felt the way she had that day. So she nodded. I'd be honored. The first meeting was held in the bank's small community room, usually used for financial literacy workshops. There were 6 people around the table: a retired teacher, a young mother who ran a home daycare, a mechanic who'd lived on the block for 30 years, and 2 others who'd also experienced moments of being brushed off or misunderstood in places that were supposed to serve them. They didn't talk about policies or profits. They talked about respect, about patience, about how sometimes all it takes is one person slowing down long enough to listen. The bank listened, and changed. Meanwhile, the man who'd stepped in that day never made a show of it. He didn't post photos or give interviews, but he kept showing up in ways that mattered. A few weeks after the incident, he quietly funded a new seating area outside the community center where the older woman volunteered, complete with shade umbrellas and benches with armrests for easier standing. He never put his name on it, just a small plaque that read, "For those who've carried others, now it's your turn to rest." He'd visit her now and then, always unannounced, always with something simple, a bag of oranges, a book he thought she'd like, or just time. They'd sit on her porch sipping sweet tea, talking about everything and nothing. He never acted like he'd saved her. If anything, he seemed grateful for her stories, her wisdom, the way she remembered the names of every child who came through the food pantry. One evening, as fireflies blinked in the dusk, she asked him, "Why did you do it?" "You didn't have to get involved." He stirred his tea slowly. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stay quiet," he said. "And because you once gave a stranger a slice of cobbler just because he looked sad? That kind of kindness? It doesn't disappear. It comes back around," she smiled. She hadn't even remembered that. Life in the neighborhood kept moving, but with a gentler rhythm. The cafe across the street started offering senior hours on weekday mornings, quieter, slower, with bigger print on the menus. The bus company added a stop closer to the senior apartments after someone mentioned how hard the walk had become. None of it was flashy. None of it made headlines. But together it wove a safety net made of attention and care. The video that had briefly circulated online, the person who filmed it deleted it after learning the older woman didn't want to be a symbol. She's not a story, they told a friend. She's a person, and she deserves peace, not clicks. That choice, too, became part of the quiet shift, a reminder that real change doesn't need an audience. Sometimes it just needs one person to act and another to forgive, and a community willing to do better. As autumn turned to winter, the older woman celebrated her 79th birthday. Not with a big party, but with a potluck at the community center. Neighbors brought dishes, collard greens, cornbread, peach cobbler, her favorite. The man who'd helped her showed up with a potted camellia bush. It blooms in winter, he said. When everything else looks dead, it reminds you life's still there. She planted it by her window. Now when she looks out, she sees more than the laundromat or the passing cars. She sees a street full of people who know each other's names, who hold doors, who ask, "You okay?" and mean it. Who remember that dignity isn't earned, it's given freely to everyone. The bank incident never defined her. But it did remind her and everyone around her that kindness isn't weakness. Patience isn't wasted time, and showing up for someone, even in the smallest way, can change the course of their day, their week, maybe even their life. She still walks a little slower. Her hands still shake sometimes. But she stands taller now, not because the world changed overnight, but because she learned she wasn't alone in it. And on quiet afternoons, when the sun slants just right through her window and the camellia blooms bright against the gray sky, she sips her tea, smiles to herself, and thinks, "This is enough. This is good, no drama, no villains. Just people choosing again and again to be human. And in the end, that's what matters most."